Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome everyone. My name is Divi Sagar. I'm the president and the founder of the International Commission for Dalit Rights. I grew up in a remote village in Nepal, which is a place that continues the struggle with the recognizing and respecting human dignity and enforcing equal rights. Nepal is one of the South Asian countries that still uses the caste system and practices caste-based discrimination. Personally, I was exposed to and became aware of caste-based discrimination at a very young age while attending school, where I was mistreated and disrespected by my peers. Over the time, I realized I wasn't the only victim of this inhuman treatment. There are more than 300 million people in South Asia and in around 60 million people in the United States and around the globe who have been facing racial injustice, caste, work, and descent-based discrimination and inequality. In 2020, 123 Black Americans were shot and killed, including Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old Black girl, by the police in the United States. Likewise, there have been more than 1,500 cases of caste-based atrocities in the South Asia during the COVID-19 pandemic that include 24 killings in Nepal and 105 murders in India alone. This week, we are deeply saddened by the loss of Samjana Biki, a 12 years young girl, and Manisha Balmiki, a 19 years another girls in Nepal and in India, who were brutally raped and killed by the dominant caste group. The world should seek justice for these bright and beautiful girls. As we all know, these are not isolated atrocities, but they remain the daily incident which go unreported because of biased justice system. Despite the constitutional and legal mechanism, the trend of police brutality in the United States and South Asia against the Dalit and Black Americans has been increasing. In addition to that, COVID-19 outbreak presents the potential health, financial, and justice challenges for the Black, Dalit, minorities, underprivileged populations. And the government failed to protect these populations and have not come up with an adequate program to respond and to protect society from the racial injustice, caste-based discrimination, socioeconomic disparity, and other forms of discrimination. This pandemic has been an excuse for the government, and this has no doubt been a life-threatening burden for the people of colors, minorities, Dalit, and the other underprivileged populations. Today, we are here to discuss and address these challenges and devise the solution to promote the racial justice and Dalit right at all levels. Our mission is to globalize Dalit rights and the racial justice movement together and help transform society. To accomplish this, we must come together and establish solidarity and collaborate to combat the racism and casteism in the 21st century. And I'm sure we shall overcome. Our conference is going to begin with keynote remarks by Judge Rahul Amin Quandra, and then 2 outstanding panel sessions and question answer. I hope you will enjoy and engage in the event. And thank you for your time and present participation. First, I would like to introduce Judge Rahul Amin Quandra. Mr. Rahul Amin Quandra is serving as an advisor at the International Commission for Dalit Rights, and he is a multi-generational Washingtonian and a member of the Quandra family, whose American lineage traces back almost 350 years in the Maryland and Virginia colonies, including involuntary servitude at the George Washington's Mount Vernon plantation. Mr. Quandra is a Howard University graduate, and he is a retired senior law administrative judge for the District of Columbia. Within the context of today's theme and discussion on the civil right of and the humanity for the Dalit people, Judge Quandra has been on the mission to uplift through the education and the continues in that mode. Judge Quandra continues to work to improve the condition of all people worldwide and is currently identified with the Dalit freedom movement. He assumed a lead role in sponsoring two-day human rights program at the Howard University and the Capitol Hill to speak out on behalf of the Dalit communities. Mr. Quandra has been a truly friend of Dalit right movement and the civil right, and has been engaged in the civil right movement for a decade. Without further ado, I would like to invite Judge Quandra to deliver your keynote remarks. Thank you. You are Judge Quandra, you are in.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. To our third global mini-conference we have scheduled here in Washington, D.C., wherein we will advise and to address on a continuous issue of concern, racism and casteism, that is facing us today in both these United States and the countries that constitute and include the Indian subcontinent area and their adverse effects upon denying basic human rights to those entitled thereto by reason of their birth. My charge to you today is indict those persons or organizations that continue to work against our humanity. Call them out, cry out for justice for those who perceive themselves as powerless, many of whom have given up in frustration. Let it not be said at the end of this conference that we, who have access to resources in society that can effectuate change, have failed to do so. Although the global conference is virtual, all of us who are participating today or who are tuned in from various seats of political power, whether in Washington, New York, Boston, London, Delhi, Kathmandu, or Calcutta, my own family hometown city, each of us has a visible presence, a place of respect, and are able, when unified, to sound voices crying out, make straight the way of justice. Hear us now and heed those who are agitating for right, so that that which is right will be done. There is a heightened awareness at the plate of some 40 million or so African Americans who are pleading, "Get your knee off my neck, I can't breathe." Likewise, there is heightened awareness of the plight of some 250 million or so Dalits and others unfavorable people in India, and millions more situated parallelly elsewhere, such as Nepal or Bangladesh, Pakistan, and other countries as well. Both groups are seemingly locked or feel that they are locked into a permanency of perpetuation which ties them indiscriminately to the lowest caste. Our duty, our work, and commission is to further the missions of Dr. Rimbaud, Ambedkar, and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, each addressing in the mid-1940s this seemingly intractable situation through their written correspondences. The significance of the causes of the oppressed peoples, significantly to the untouchables of India and to the Negroes of the United States. Those were the terms, the words they used back in the 1940s. Still, there is much work to do, many hills to climb, many rivers to cross, but sooner or later, and let's hope it's sooner rather than later, we must take up that commitment. We must continue to be focused. We must fulfill that commitment to those who have placed their faith in us to never give up. Said city and dominant will then be the fullest, I said city, I meant city on the hill, will be the full realization of our own respective potentials. When Nelson Mandela addressed the United States Congress in 1990 here in Washington, D.C., he said, and I quote, "To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. To impose on them a wretched life of hunger and dehumanization and deprivation is to dehumanize them." Picking up on that, President Barack Obama, in a state visit to India in November 2010, in addressing the Congress of India, said, and I quote, "We believe that no matter who you are or where you come from, every person can fulfill their God-given potential, just as a Dalit like Dr. Ambedkar could lift himself up and pen the words of the Constitution that protects the rights of all Indians." Barack Obama went on to say also, "We believe that no matter where you live, whether a village in Punjab or the by-lanes of Chandni Chowk, an old section of Kolkata, or perhaps a new high-rise in Bangalore, every person deserves the same chance to live in security and dignity, to get an education, to find work, and to give their children a better future," end of quote. Now, I harbor no illusions this morning about my words. I think not for one moment that my utterances will make straight the crooked path. Still, there is a denial of recognition in the value of Black lives. Breonna Taylor, say her name. Not yet is there universal acceptance of the worth of some 250 million Dalits enslaved in India and elsewhere. Therefore, we must continue on. Today's efforts will one day be looked upon, and when they are, let it be said and let it be true, the steps were taken, that intelligent and thinking minds assembled, that the key issue of human rights and entitlements thereto were raised as an integral component of advancing the cause of justice for all people. The problems of racism and casteism do not exist in isolation. Such was not noted long ago in 1873, for example, when Jatiro Poole a well-known and respected social reformer in India, began his polemical text, you might be familiar with it, Gulamgiri, which is slavery translated, with a dedication to the efforts of the American abolitionists in the United States, whose sustained efforts had contributed mightily to the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Poole noted, and he said, and I quote, "It is an earnest desire that my countrymen may take their example, this example, as their guide in the emancipation of their Sudra brethren from the trammels of the Brahmin thraldom." End of quote. Now, I've been asked a number of times if African Americans are aware of the plight of the Dalit people and the issues that they are faced with today. And my answer is not nearly enough. To change that perspective, we must create an awareness, a plan to follow. To be aware of the Dalit plight, African Americans must first expand their thinking, their knowledge, and learn more about the rest of the world. Become more fully aware and realize that our own historical legacy of enslavement is not unique, indeed. And we must educate ourselves, both Black and white, to the plight of enslaved people the world over. Only then will we move the barometer on African American knowledge and thinking on this subject. As well, we're learning about and respect Indian culture and history, but we must not let that create an atmosphere that accommodates mistreatment of a past era when the rights of human dignity were not considered in the same way, or not considered at all, perhaps didn't exist. Like in our own homeland, United States of America, such attitudes must change and be reflected in the present. Almost 70 years ago, untouchability as a permanent status in Indian society was formally abolished. Even the Indian Constitution, primarily penned by Dr. Ambedkar, himself a Dalit, at Article 17 recites equal protection for the Dalit people. Yet, these words will remain without force and effect and meaning if those of us who can help to bring about the needed improvements ignore our obligation and responsibility to do so. We have many distinguished guests today, but time only permits a reference to a couple of them. One of them is Shiraj Yengde, a distinguished Dalit scholar who noted in his recent book, Caste Matters, that access is the route to preparing Dalits to be competitive in the 21st century, so that the Dalit people can earn those places that will assure their stability and a visible future for themselves and their children. Also with us today is Professor Kevin Brown, a well-known and widely published scholar with several articles, including one titled Race Across Boundaries, that was published in the Harvard Black Little Law Journal some time ago. And in this publication, he noted several lessons learned from examining a comparison of the application of constitutional and federal discrimination laws to higher educational opportunities to African Americans in the United States and Indians and Dalits in India and elsewhere. Perhaps we might learn some very valuable lessons from what he has penned, or will say today. Now, nothing is more timelier than today, September 26th, than the words of noted author and Pulitzer Prize winner Isabel Wilkerson, who in her very recent book, Caste, noted that the American Jim Crow and the caste system are quite similar and parallel and must not be viewed in isolation. Both groups are noted in a hierarchy that is based upon injustice and seeks to confine us to a permanent underclass. The highly visible and vocal movement Black Lives Matter is belatedly opening the eyes and ears of the majority population, for them to see and hear that which is so important as to what lies beneath is the truth of the American caste system. No matter what we choose to call it, it continues to prevail. Wilkerson goes on to say that slavery to the Blacks in America and casteism to India and all other affected Dalits in other locations is not just a chapter in our respective histories, it is our history. As such, all of the effects and the interwoven threads are throughout and are constituents and constitute our own nation's respective legacies. 1 second. I just mentioned Siraj's book, Caste Matters, and I call it to your attention and urge all of you to get it, read it, and take the words to heart. In conclusion, let me say, there are several questions. And for something so deeply ingrained in both societies, what can we do? How can we combat this? What steps are required to remove the embedded stains of hatred? Is it worth trying? Where and how do we begin? These are all valued queries, the answers to which are not easily come by, but come by and resolve we must. Perhaps, most likely not in our lifetimes, these pressing and sustained issues will be satisfactorily addressed and resolved. We would not be here today, at least not in this current capacity, if substantial work on the issues had not already been undertaken and now must continue. The ancestors have spoken and spoken out and spoken up, drawing the path, leading the way, building a bridge from then to now and on to the present and future, as we must pick up the mantle and carry it forward, cross that river to the city, the shining city on the hill. In our own America, it has taken a long time to force the day of reckoning. But with continued hope and help from our fellow concerned citizens, things have and continue to change. And they can in India too, as more Indian citizens face the reality of the wrong that continues to be done. Outside influences are not interferences in Indian culture and society, as some would claim, but rather a common sense and approach to human rights, as all are thus entitled to. We must approach these wrongs, and which have been perpetuated for too long, still making it truly lasting is the responsibility of the Indian people themselves, and must come from within their society without relying unduly upon and aid and support from outside forces. Today's scholars, and you're going to hear from them momentarily, today's scholars and authors are valuable components of our educational process. So let's proceed and give heed to what our distinguished guests have to say. As we begin, let's also keep in mind and recall some of the conclusionary words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who here in Washington, D.C. on August the 28th, 1963, in his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial said, "Let freedom ring, let freedom ring, let freedom ring." Thank you and enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is very much inspiring remark, and with the questions where what can we do and where and how does it begins. It's very inspiring, very much. That's why we are here today. We are going to discuss and explore the, the progress and challenges, and then also we will come up with the solution that bring together to different dimensions, racial justice and the Dalit right movement, and move ahead to globalize. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the next, our first panel. And I would like to introduce the Dr. Purvi Mehta. She is an assistant professor at the Colorado College in Colorado, and an advisor at a board member of the ICDR International. She is a researcher. She is doing her fantastic work on the caste, gender, and human rights issue in India. Her book, uh, manuscript tentatively titled for Recasting Caste, Historical of Transnational Dalit Activism and the Internationalization of the Caste Discrimination, analyze the post-independent Dalit activism in India. It explored how the activists have connected with other global issues, particularly social justice movement, and how activists have increasingly turned to human rights for resources against the caste-based discrimination and violence. So without further ado, Purvi Mehta, you are here for the
Yes.
first session to moderate and to chair. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sek. I'm honored and delighted to moderate this panel of activists, scholars, and leaders that have done so much, both locally and globally, for the Dalit struggle for social justice. Sorry. So the presentations in this panel will focus on different aspects of caste discrimination, and will discuss strategies and partnerships in the global movement for Dalit rights. So the first speaker on this panel is Professor Kevin Brown. Professor Brown is the Richard S. Melvin Professor, is the Richard S. Melvin Professor at Indiana University's Mars School of Law. Professor Brown is a graduate of the Indiana University Kelley School of Business and of Yale Law School. He has been on the faculty of the Mars Law School since 1987, where he teaches courses such as race and law, law and education, and a seminar on transnational inequality. Professor Brown was a Fulbright Scholar in 1997 at the National Law School in Bangalore and the Indian Law Institute in New Delhi. He has also taught in South Africa, China, and the UK. An original participant of the Critical Race Theory Workshop, Brown is a frequent speaker at scholarly conferences on issues of race and discrimination. His research interests are primarily in the area of comparative inequality and US race law. He has published 2 books and over 80 articles or comments on these issues, and his current book project is tentatively entitled The Caste Analogy Remix, The Benefits for the Black Community from Comparing Their Liberation Struggle to that of Dalits in India. So I will now turn it over to Professor Brown.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction, and it is certainly an honor for me to be here today. What I'm going to actually spend my time talking about today is the Cisco Systems Inc. case and the opportunity that it presents for Dalits to bring their claim to the legal system for discrimination. Now, as many of you already know, this is the case where the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing filed an action on June 30th, 2020 against Cisco Systems Inc. The action is to remedy workplace discrimination at Cisco's San Jose, California headquarters. And the action was filed under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the California Fair Housing Employment Act. The department is alleging that John Doe, a Dalit, was the victim of employment discrimination based on religion, ancestry, national origin, ethnicity, race, and color. But I'm going to focus primarily on the charge that he's a victim of discrimination based on race, because I think that's the strongest argument. But before I do that, one needs to understand that American society is still a society subject to the role of law despite our current president. To truly understand American society, you have to understand the commitment to individualism, especially under our legal system. The American style of individualism is one that seeks to maximize the ability of the individual to pursue his self-determined goals and objectives. It's based upon the idea that views individuals as engaged in a lifelong process of discovering their true self and then going about and lining up the other aspects of their life so that they're consistent with that true self. Within this form of thinking, then, the evil is something that constrains individual self-determination. So this is an anti-tradition as well as anti-involuntary group form of thought. It is thus at war with any tradition, whether those traditions come from racial, religious, or caste characteristics. And anyone can discriminate against anyone and thereby deny anyone their ability to be self-determined. So Americans can easily recognize race discrimination by someone Black against someone else Black, or in this case, by someone who's South Asian against someone else who's South Asian. Now, I know that there's a tendency to want to analogize the function of race in the US to the function of caste in India. And people who do that tend to think of whites as a higher caste, with Blacks as the lower caste, and perhaps the other racial groups somewhere in between. This form of reasoning, however, misunderstands American individualism and fails to take into account the historical development of our individualism. The American form of individualism was born out of a desire to liberate whites from the ethnic and religious traditions that they brought with them from Europe. As such, it tends to obscure the notion for whites that they are a racial group. After all, if you're an individual, you can't be a member of a racial group. So you're not so much a white person, rather you're simply an individual. So for whites, being white, it's simply the normal state of affairs. Thus, whites are not conscious of their race in the same way that upper caste Hindus are conscious of their caste. Whites can easily recognize individuals have a race. For example, they'll readily see that I'm Black, but they have a much more difficult time grasping the concept that they are white, because as I said, if you're an individual, you can't be a member of a white racial group. So given this form of societal thinking, discrimination based on caste is something that Americans would find abhorrent. And we would find it abhorrent simply because it's a denial of individual self-determination. Indeed, if you think about the major domestic movements that the US has gone through since the end of World War II, many of them are simply a reflection of the expansion of the culture of individualism. So for example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s was to try to transcend the concept of race in order to treat Black people as individuals, followed by the women's rights movement of the 1970s. It was to make gender or sex irrelevant so that we could treat everyone as individuals. This movement was then followed by those suffering from physical handicaps who made the same argument. And now we're coming to the end of the movement by gays and lesbians, where they too have basically been saying, don't discriminate against us for a characteristic we do not choose, because that constrains our individual self-determination. Indeed, as a side note, if one thinks about the Black Lives Matters movement, the reason it is so effective and also so controversial is based on individualism. It's effective because it tracks the notion that individuals should be treated the same and that Black people are treated worse than others. But it's also controversial because it requires the conscious consideration of race, and hence focus on how a group has been treated differently from other groups, which violates individualism. So with this introduction now, I want to turn to our employment discrimination law. In the US, as in India, a person is a part of two legal jurisdictions. There's a state jurisdiction and a federal jurisdiction. So when it comes to employment discrimination law, a state may have its own employment discrimination law, and this is the case in California. California's employment discrimination law, however, includes a category for ancestry that is not in the federal law. Hence, there's an additional argument to address employment discrimination against knowledge under California law that does not exist under the federal law. But I want to focus on the federal law because that would apply to all the 50 states. Now, the main federal employment discrimination law is Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Indeed, if you think back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. in August of 1963, the 1964 Civil Rights Act is the law that comes out of that movement. So we're going back over 50 years to when America began its civil rights mission to talk about when our employment discrimination law was created. And as you could imagine, in 1964, American society knew nothing at all about caste discrimination. But indeed, at the time, America did also thought that gays and lesbians suffered from a mental disease. Thus, the Congress that passed the 1964 Civil Rights Law could not have expected that it would protect employment discrimination against gays and lesbians. But that is exactly what our Supreme Court ruled in a case called Bostock versus Covington this past summer. In Bostock, the Supreme Court adopts a new theory of employment discrimination, which can be directly analogized to discrimination against Dalits. So this is a case that was rendered, an opinion was rendered in June 20th of 2020, where what the court did was to conclude that employment discrimination against gays, lesbians, and transgendered are sex discrimination for purposes of Title VII's employment discrimination law. As the court put it, the test is whether changing the sex of a homosexual would eliminate the discrimination. In other words, to determine if a gay man is a victim of sex discrimination covered under Title VII, you take the gay man and you change his sex. If he were a woman, then would he have been discriminated against? And given the fact that the answer is that a gay man now turned woman would not be discriminated against, the court concludes that's discrimination based on sex. Now, you may have realized, of course, that if you change the sex of a gay man to a woman, they're no longer homosexual. The court noted this is true, but it simply means that any form of discrimination against a homosexual is by definition also discrimination based on sex. Take this same rationale now and apply it to a Dalit who's a victim of discrimination based on untouchability. One could use religion as an example to see how this would work. Say a Dalit converts to Buddhism, Islam, or Christianity. None of these religions have caste, but if you ask the question, would the Dalit who's now a Buddhist, Christian, or Muslim still be a victim of discrimination? The answer would be yes. Therefore, the court would say it is not religious discrimination that's included in Title VII. But let's instead say we take our same Dalit and change our Dalit's race. And in the US, the racial groups that we recognize are Black, White, Asian, American Indian, and Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. So if you take our Dalit and change their race from what we would consider Asian to Black or white, would they continue to be a victim of caste discrimination? The answer to this would be no, because you really don't have Black or white dollars. Thus, given this test by the Supreme Court, that change in race, which would eliminate the discrimination, means that the discrimination is in fact racial discrimination. And that is a very powerful argument that Dalits now have challenging employment discrimination that did not exist before June of 2020. And what I would do is I recognize that Cisco will see this too and will attempt to settle this case. What I would really urge Dalits who have employment discrimination claims that they could make to file them now so that we can build up a number of claims to bring them through the federal courts in order to finally get a decision that holds caste discrimination is illegal under employment discrimination law in the US. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening to me.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Brown, for that talk. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Fulmer. Dr. Stephen Fulmer has served as a founding board member of the ICDR since 2009, and he has also served as a Caste Freedom Index expert. Dr. Fulmer is currently chair and associate professor of the Department of Anthropology at Wake Forest University. Since 2001, he has committed his research to issues affecting Dalits. He has written several articles and done extensive research on Dalit identity, rights, and mental health. He also conducts workshops in Nepal for Dalit scholars. So now I will turn it to Dr. Fulmer.
Thank you very much, Purvi. And like Kevin, I'm very honored to speak to such an august group, and I would like to welcome you all to the conference as well. My topic today is caste discrimination in human life, and in it I will focus most of my comments on Nepal, where I have done my research, but much of what I say will apply to other areas of South Asia. Despite the innumerable infractions against Dalit people reported in the press and social media, many people and institutions of power and privilege systematically deny the existence of caste or caste discrimination. Others defend caste as an expression of culture and therefore justify the exclusionary and humiliating practices associated with it. Denial or ignorance of the profoundly damaging effects of caste discrimination on its victims has recently compelled artists in Kathmandu to highlight this issue. Nepali actor Rajesh Hamal points out the need to, quote, make people realize caste discrimination and give them a perspective on what our society reality is. Our purpose today is similar but broader, to point out the social reality of casteism to a global community in order to contribute to dismantling structures that oppress. Recognition is still somewhat surprisingly at the core of the problem. Perhaps this is because caste-based atrocities reside easily in uncomfortable spaces between layers of society in which casteism is played out. On the legal level, the government, international agencies, and the press formally, though not necessarily genuinely, recognize the human rights of Dalit people, at least to some degree. But on the local, communal level, in which intercaste relationships are enacted by individuals, there is much denial. People with privilege cleverly launder rhetoric so that it appears to be caste neutral, but underlying the rhetoric, casteism thrives. When governance is at odds with everyday people's behavior, especially those who possess social power over others, the result appears to be the failure of enforcement. Even when the laws are in place, they are not upheld. This is clear in the case of Dalits. Written codes are worth nothing if informal behavior ignores and breaks them without real consequence. The tragedy of the condition of Dalit existence is well documented in statistics that illustrate that Dalit castes occupy the poorest stratum of society, have the least education, suffer the poorest health, along with the most insufficient access to health care, live in the worst housing, endure the highest infant mortality, and are abandoned to the least adequate political representation. The statistics are crushing, but just as heartbreaking are the narratives of the lives of Dalit people who endure the indignity of their caste status. Where do we begin to budge a system that is so weighty that it has endured for millennia? In this conference, we focus on the relationship between caste and race, a highly complex and subtle relationship that is often misunderstood, as is evident in the presentation that Dr. Brown just gave us. Because caste is the focus of social structure in South Asia, its relationship to race is difficult to specify. In Nepal, the main racial division is understood to be between Aryans and Mongolians, often described as differences in types of nose rather than in colors of skin. More to the point, the Mongolian race is often described as being outside the caste system and indifferent to caste. However, the Gurung people, as but one of numerous examples, are often portrayed as not having castes. But among Gurungs, a clear hierarchy exists between the so-called 4 clans and the so-called 16 clans. The word used to refer to clan is jat, which can also easily be translated as caste. Moreover, although Gurung Dalit relations are sometimes characterized as being relatively equal, I have observed innumerable discriminations of Dalit people by Gurungs or other so-called Mongolian ethnic groups. A myth has arisen that Dalit people in areas dominated by these ethnic groups enjoy equality with them. Even though this can be easily shown to be false, the equally false conclusion is nonetheless reached that caste does not exist in such places. Simply put, casteism in the form of discrimination against Dalits, although denied, exists within and across so-called racial groups in Nepal in spite of laws against it. So where is the rule of law in Nepal? I think back to Dor Bahadur Bista's brilliant book on the failure of development in Nepal, entitled Fatalism and Development. In it, he points out that governmental machinery in Nepal does not run on the octane of the rule of law, but on the ethanol of personal connection, or afnomanchi, and the obeisance to influential people, practices known as chakari. Why are these relevant here? Because adherence to one's personal connections and paying chakari to powerful people are partially at play in criminal acts against Dalits, as when a police officer refuses to file a case on behalf of a Dalit who has a grievance against a powerful person, or when a government official gets away scot-free for his involvement in the murder of a Dalit man, or when a local village development committee overlooks the problems of a Dalit community in favor of the wants of a Brahmin or Chetri community. In nearly 20 years of ethnographic research, concentrating on the conditions of Dalit life in Nepal, my field notes are peppered with stories that document the commonplace suffering of Dalit people. Some speak of the crushing psychological burden of the unrelenting indignities of Dalit life. One 28-year-old man told me 2 years ago, "It feels always bad for me when I remember the time I was being treated differently from my friends. And being Dalit, obviously, no one feels proud because you can see there is domination, there is oppression. There are so many things that Dalits are experiencing. For me, when I was a kid, I didn't know anything about caste." The narrative that he gave me that day is much too long to recount here. But he did go on to illustrate how the effects of being Dalit start early in life, confusing at first, but eventually defining being Dalit as an all-encompassing experience, never going away. His is but one story among the 5 million Dalit people in Nepal, one story among the 330 million Dalits in the world, a population roughly equal to that of the United States. Caste-based discrimination seeps into every aspect of life, even in modern times. Over 200 specific types of casteism have been identified for Nepal. Most discrimination takes the form of direct interpersonal injustices I have just mentioned, barring someone from a tea shop or temple, attacking a Dalit who has crossed a symbolic boundary, refusing to enter a Dalit neighborhood, or to rent an apartment in a building in a Dalit neighborhood. The cumulative effect of these structural barriers prevents Dalits from enjoying the material benefits that are thought to be available to all. They are even denied dreaming of them. Many of these acts are illegal, not part of the legal structure. Few are punished. It is not possible to legislate against the thoughts of people who discriminate. We can only legislate behavior. But it is not enough simply to legislate. There must also be enforcement. The sad truth is that enforcement has to be at the individual level, in contrast to how Dr. Brown just described how the legal system operates in the United States. It has a difficult time holding people who discriminate to account. But currently, at the local level, at least in Nepal, there are no effective mechanisms to prevent or redress casteist atrocities. My purpose in this forum has not been to develop recommendations for effective legal mechanisms to defend Dalits against casteism, but to point out one indispensable direction that advocacy and action must take. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fomar. Our next speaker is Anjana Bishanke. Representative Anjana Bishanke has been a member of Nepal's House of Representatives, where she was on the Committee on Education and Health, and has also served as an interim legislative parliament member. She's currently a Central Committee member of the Communist Party of Nepal and is the Deputy Chief of the Health Department of the Nepal Communist Party. She has served as both a Central Committee member and an All-District Secretariat of the All Nepal Women's Association, and has also been a member of the All Nepal National Free Independent Student Union. She is also an active contributor to various newspapers and is a columnist for the Jankata Weekly. So I will turn it over to Representative Bishanke now. Okay, sorry, I just got a note that she is unfortunately unable to attend, so we will move on to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Dr. Suraj Yangde. Dr. Suraj Yangde is an academic activist and a noted public intellectual in the transnational movement for Dalit rights. He is the author of the best-selling Caste Matters and co-editor of the award-winning The Radical in Ambedkar. Dr. Yangde is currently a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School and an inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Initiative for Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability at Harvard University. Dr. Yangde is an international human rights attorney by qualification from India and the UK. He has worked with some of the leading international human rights organizations in Geneva, London, and New York. He is an associate editor of the Southern Journal of Contemporary History and Caste, a global journal on social exclusion. He is also a syndicated columnist at several newspapers across the world and is responsible for the popular column Dalitality in the Indian Express. He is the convener for the India for Diversity movement and the Dalit Film Festival. He is also co-convener of the Dalit of the Dalit Black Lives Matter Symposium, and he runs a monthly Ambedkar lecture series at Harvard. Dr. Yangde is actively involved in building solidarities among Dalit, Black, Roma, Indigenous, Buraku, and refugee people. Among his many honors are the Dr. Ambedkar Social Justice Award, Canada in 2019, the Rohit Vemula Memorial Scholar Award in 2018, and a nomination for India's highest literary award, the Sahitya Academy. So I will turn it to Dr. Yangde now.
Thank you. Am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
I was just trying to figure out. Very good to see you. I've put on gallery mode so I can see the wonderful and beautiful faces. I would just like to give a shout out to some of my friends, beginning with you, Purvi, and your wonderful, beautiful daughter. We hope she comes and continues to illuminate us with her beautiful smile and face.
Thank you.
I'd also like to give a shout out to Judge Quander. We've been trying to connect, but I read and we connect very often. But one day we will sit on phone and talk. Thank you for your excellent keynote. My dear friend, the distinguished Professor Kevin Brown, whose book, a forthcoming title, will be an instant hit. I say that because I'm working with him on that one. And Professor Stephen Palmer, my dear friends Paul, Vincent, D.B. Sagar, and many other friends from Nepal. Also, I see Amar is here, the young dynamic scholar from the community who we need to pay attention to. And before I begin, allow me to first of all express my gratitude to the leaders and the community people who have been consistently trying to push this dialogue for much time now. I say this with responsibility because the emphasis on caste-based discrimination in a hyper-racialized United States is almost competing to the interest of people oppressed by what Du Bois would call the color caste problem, or Alison Davis, the great anthropologist of the era, would very succinctly describe as the problem of American South or post-slavery is actually a color caste problem. And we know W. Lloyd Garner, the famous anthropologist, the English anthropologist, him and his team had come down to the South. They did a micro study of the societies that were operating, and through the extensive ethnographic observation, the empirical outcome detailed the caste-like politics that existed in the social arrangement, if you will, of American post-slavery, or the early the precursor of Jim Crow America. And that color caste then easily gets translated into solidifying the Jim Crow that we have, which basically is the discrimination that you could easily relate to the caste-based exclusions. And when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went to India, and when he came back and he gave his famous Palm Spring address to the church on Sunday, he relayed that when he was announced as an untouchable, that irked him. But also when he thought deeply about it, there were many ways he was an untouchable, and then he described the segregation based on food counters and various legislations that authenticated the color caste dynamisms. So caste has been as American pie, but in the beginning of 1920s, translating into 1930s, and obviously when civil rights or the civil rights movement of the young guns like Dr. King, SNCC, Malcolm on one side, and this young body of firebrand thinkers and organizers, when they collaborated, race became a paramount decider to contest against the white supremacist policies which were ingrained in Jim Crow. So we see a similar logic that operated in various other countries as well. The reason I talk about America is the American racial problem becomes global racial problem, which is very difficult and unnecessary for us to really understand how other societies operate. Because of course, American capitalist empire and the control on the academic thinking, many societies, because of course, lack of literature, if you will, have borrowed the Americanized theories to fix into their own problems. And this is also visible in some parts of Africa, but also the Africanist thinkers have rejected that to bring their own understanding, which is sometimes not written in English, sometimes not written at all, but the oral histories say something else. And I think the African anthropology that came out about in 50, 60 years of their lifetime now was trying to wrestle with this very question as to how do we describe race? Because if you want to describe race in Zambia, under the leadership of Kaunda, who was the first president, and of course, if you go further in the colonized parts of the European colonized parts of Africa, we have a very different experiences. But yet, race becomes a very important indicator. But the question I have is, in Indian context, or in the context of Africa, the European colonization did not happen officially for more than 400 years. If you look at the Enlightenment era, where they described the otherness of Black as inferior to the superiority of a lighter skin, there were no conceptions of race when this was decided. Race just became a biological mischief. Eventually, it was taken by anthropological founders. And of course, Franz Boas took that and also tried to subvert that in a way to talk about caste here. So you can see the early anthropological foundations were also talking about the caste problem. The if not the ultimate, the penultimate scholar being Franz Boas, and we have a lineage of that thinking that comes to Ambedkar, which my friend Jesus has traced the lineage from Boas to Goldenweiser to Ambedkar, and as to how this thinking shapes. And because we know Ambedkar is very race skeptic as much as Du Bois is. And when I say race skeptic, it's the biological understanding of race. The biology as a fake concept that was given by the early, we can loosely identify them as medical practitioners, but these were basically the colonial bureaucrats who gave a certain nuanced understanding of how, and more specifically Agassi here, who was at Harvard, had given a recognition of biology as a defining factor to organize various racial groups. Now in America, they had really created a so-called, if you will, an easy way of identifying it. There was one white, there was one Black, and then there was this mixed race. And of course, then we had the incoming of Asians and another population, but they were not yet identified, or they were not even recorded in census. They were eventually, as we see through the long history of 400-year history of this, where we continue to see this formation. Now, this is important for us to understand why then caste becomes an important indicator to make more sense of this. If you go in the Mexican caste system, now what they now have now is called mestizaje or mestizo. These are the post quote unquote racial societies or post racial formation. And Ben Vinson, a historian who had studied caste system in Mexico, identifies that the people who are Black or who are Afro descendants or Afro Mexicans who were brought as slaves or servants, indentures to work on the fields, do not identify with the race column, because the segregation they have made, unlike American paradigm, is through at least 12 to 13 various caste groups, and they have their own specific names to it. And so a 95-year-old informant informs Ben Vinson, historian, that we don't have race here. And as an American researcher, he gets, and this is in early 1990s, he says, what's happening here? Because I see you Black people. And then there is, of course, the relation. And I think if you have to build a solidarity, we have to extend the understanding of social disparity through a caste canon, because caste canon will help us bring more light to the what we call racialized formations. And race has becoming more and more stronger in our understanding. But of course, Isabel Wilkerson, as Judge Conder had given a shout out to her, in her work, she tries to summarize those historical foundations of some of this modern studies. So I think if you have to create a collaboration, what we need to do is we need to look at these societies who do not necessarily have strict racialized dynamics, or who do not strictly necessarily identify with race, but there are problems that go with color, that go with your descent, that go with the inheritance of your characteristics. And I think these are the formations which we can easily quantify into color, caste, class, as well as genderized descent-based system. And these discriminations you can find in rest of the world, including Africa, Latin America, in Europe, more specifically with Roma and Cagots, the untouchable of the French regiment, as well as when we continue to look in the East Asia, the Burakumin, as well as the South Korean, as well as non-Han population of China. So we just need newer lens and newer theoretical framework to understand this and bring them together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yangde. Okay, our next speaker is Ms. Meena Varma. Ms. Varma has been the director of the Dalit Solidarity Network UK since 2007, and since 2017, she has been the executive director of the International Dalit Solidarity Network. The IDCN links grassroots struggles with international mechanisms and institutions in order to change the policies and practices that lead to and maintain caste discrimination. The network serves a critical function in the documentation of caste discrimination and in lobbying on national and international levels. Ms. Varma manages the IDSM, and works closely with the IDSN board and network members in leading its strategy. Ms. Varma is also the coordinator of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group for Dalits and the chair of the Council of Minority Rights Group International. She has also been a board member of the Ethical Trading Initiative, where she has worked on issues of caste, business, human rights, and global supply chains. So I will turn it to Ms. Varma now.
Thank you so much. I feel truly humbled to be here. I'd like to really thank the organizers, ICDR, and the team behind you all, because this is an amazing result to get so many incredible speakers and in fact, an incredible audience. I mean, I think just looking through the people participating, it's really quite amazing. And now I have to have the dubious honor of trying to follow Judge Quander and Kevin Brown and Steve Fulmer and Purvi herself and of course Suraj, who I've never actually been on a panel with. So I'm delighted that I am finally achieving that goal. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we do and why we do it. The International Dalit Solidarity Network, I mean, that's what it says in its name, and that's what we try to do. It works in solidarity with its members, and we have members from across the globe, and many of those members are participating in this event today. So I'm delighted to see all of you, and a big shout out to many of you. We are working at the international level, both at the United Nations and also at the EU level, to ensure that caste-based discrimination is on the international arena. So it's great that we've heard from a lot of the speakers of the issues and how caste affects daily life. But I think really now we need to move to what do we do about it? Caste is not just, it's not a single country, it's not a single race, it's not a single religion. I mean, I know I have my good friend Vincent here today, and he's going to speak to you a little bit later about this, but caste affects across religions. It is an infrastructure structural problem, and we need to make sure that it now becomes an international solution. IDSN really has a very strong record of working with UN human rights mechanisms through the Human Rights Council, through the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, through special procedures, treaty bodies. And it's a well-known phenomenon now to these mechanisms because we continue to pursue a really coherent advocacy strategy. We bring it to the table every single Human Rights Council and with every single mandate holder, because as we know, caste affects disproportionately every single declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that is dignity, that is access to education, access to health, and across the board. So we look at those special rapporteurs, we speak to them, we introduce ourselves as soon as there are new ones, and that is the problem, because every time there is a new special rapporteur, and these are the people that take on the mandate of minority issues, they take on the mandate of poverty, they take on the mandate of housing, every single time there's a new one, we have to reintroduce ourselves, we have to reintroduce the issue, and sometimes it feels like we're starting from scratch every single time. And that is a problem. Why are we starting from scratch? Why is not this global issue actually understood globally? Why is it that every time we talk about caste-based discrimination, people are like, really? Well, what is that? Why do I need to address it? And yet we're talking 260 million people. So I feel that for us working on this on an international basis, and I'm bearing in mind, I've just sat through as well Kevin's presentation where he talks about the Cisco Inc. case. We have cases. I'm actually based in London. As Purvi said, you know, I'm the director of the DSN here in the UK as well. And we have shown our government here in the UK that caste is not a South Asian problem. Caste is a global issue. And actually it is a diasporic issue, so that every time any of us go from wherever we may have our origins in, we take caste with us. Why do we do that? Why is that so structural? And when we take the caste with us, we take discrimination with us. So we have to make sure that there are legislations in place across the globe. So international solidarity isn't just about the UN, and I know that that is part of what I'm here to talk about. It's about ensuring now that caste features as discriminatory protected characteristic in the US, in the UK, in Canada, across the globe, Australia. We need to ensure that now that global issue, as I said, becomes a global solution. I think it is important that, you know, when we're talking about making sure that people understand this, we relate it very clearly. So when we talk to the Special Rapporteur and contemporary forms of slavery, we talk about the forced labor and the bonded labor that continues today. We talk about child labor. We make sure that those realities are reflected in Dalit issues, and it's so important that that continues. And part of that is ensuring that that reality is not only addressed by the UN, but the fact that slavery continues, it's also addressed by international business. International business, supply chains is a really important issue because, as I say often, business and money talks. It's really important that we get to businesses so that when they talk to governments, they can say, well, we're going to have to address this in our supply chain. We want to work to ensure that our supply chains are slave-free. So to be slave-free, they have to be caste discrimination-free. And I think one of those issues, therefore taking that forward, is that for us all to talk to those businesses, whether they be nationally or whether they be internationally. That is really important. And I think, you know, one of the things that I would like to say also here today is that the gender issue, which again, I know that Manjula will be covering later, is also really important. And we've had some really amazing successes at the UN. We do have very, very clear support from the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, but also the working group. And it's important that it's not just about the one person, as I said before, because the one person comes, the one person goes. Whereas if you get into the working groups on these issues, you lay foundations. And let's not forget, as with all these things, including this conference, it's not about the person and the face at the front, it's all the people at the back. It's all the people that actually work to help. It's like the civil servants, they are the backbone of government. Governments come, governments go. We need to make sure that it's important that we are talking behind the scenes, in front of the scenes. But as I often say, international solidarity and what IDSN does is not led by me. It's led by our members. Our mandate comes from our members, and we have to remember that international solidarity is about that. It is about solidarity with all of those people that are around this table today, with all the people that I work with on a day-to-day basis. And as I said, I have so many of those. But I mean, I think it's really important just also to very quickly follow up, and I know I'm running out of time, Purvi, on what Steve said. Again, you know, it's about enforcement of law. Enforcement of law doesn't change mindsets overnight, but it will change behaviors. And I think it's really important that, you know, we recognize that rights are not rights without remedies, and laws are not laws without implementation. But international solidarity for me, you know, is about standing by you and with you, and we need to make sure that we really shout from the highest mountains to ensure that we chip away at this terrible structure that is caste discrimination. There are two small quotes that I'm just going to end on. You know, caste knows no boundaries. We know that. There is no boundary of country, there is no boundary of race, and there is no boundary of religion. So if caste knows no boundaries, neither should we. We need to move this forward. And I think, you know, the quote is, let us stand in solidarity, not to a specific country, race, or religion, but rather to humanity. And Malcolm X actually said, when I is replaced with we, then even illness becomes wellness. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Oops, there we go. And our final speaker on this panel is Mr. Paul Divakkar. Ms. N. Paul Divakkar is an advocate for Dalit rights, an expert on economic rights, and a human rights defender. He's the convener of the Global Forum on Discrimination Based on Work and Dissent, a platform that emerged from joining the struggles of various groups around the world, including Dalits in South Asia, the Roma in Europe, the Nino in Africa, and the Quilombola in Brazil. The Global Forum convenes the Social Justice Task Force of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Mr. Divakkar is one of the founding members of the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights and also serves as the chairperson of the Asia Dalit Rights Forum, which works on issues of untouchability and caste discrimination. He continues to be active popularizing sustainable development goals and incorporating a focus on inclusion in the discourse on the new development paradigm. Mr. Divakkar works closely with communities and actively supports their access to justice. He promotes attention to gender concerns in matters of caste and issues of financial accountability, transparency, and participation. He has a deep interest in the economic empowerment of Dalit and DWD communities and advocates for equity in budgeting from the lens of the marginalized. So I will now turn it to Mr. Divakkar.
Good morning, good evening, Purvi, and organizers and leaders of the ICDR, Sagar. Really great that you and the team and the leaders of ICDR have organized Jai Bhim, Judge Kwanda, Steve, Kevin, Suraj, Meena, who have just spoken. Greetings and great to be together. I would also like to acknowledge our Asia Dalit Rights Forum leaders here, Bhakta, Rembai, Ganesh, Vincent, Manjula, and several others, but also greetings from the Global Forum on Discrimination Based on Work and Dissent. I especially would like to recognize Isaac Blake from Ireland or UK, who's here with us from the Roma community. Welcome, Isaac. Great that you're able. But we also had Dominic Pierre from Burkina Faso, one of the countries from Western Africa, who has also been here. I do not know if she is still here. Primarily because of the shortage of time, I would like to just focus on clearly this whole link between race and caste, but bring in the concept of discrimination based on work and descent. It's not I mean, we have been one of the movers of this together with the International Dalit Solidarity Network, Asia Dalit Rights Forum, and others, both from the time of the of the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, where we pushed, and then this whole series of studies have come out from the UN. My submission is, in as much as these are all social constructs, and I agree with Suraj, definitely this kind of a biological definitions of either race or caste, I think would be very, very misleading. But however, these are constructs which are driving legislation and which we need to profile in order for us to have some protection through constitutional and legislative mechanisms, and also certain acts which ensure supposed to be ensuring protection, but of course we need to ensure that there is greater implementation. But what I would like to submit is, while we have clear framework for race, and also here I would like to bring in indigeneity, the whole indigenous communities, and of course we have for minorities, we have for gender, the whole global population of over 260 million people, which if they're all together, they will be the 7th largest nation in the world. We do not have a profiled identity. We don't have a strap handle allowing us to be lifted together as how Ambedkar lifted us as either depressed classes or scheduled castes, or now Dalits in India, with one stroke. I think it's a master stroke, which right from the whole and breadth and length and breadth of the country, with Chamats, with Madigas, with Mudahar, several of these community names who have been excluded, who have been dismembered actually. I think dismembering is a much more word which is fitting, because we have not managed, we were not permitted to gather together. But in the 600,000 villages in the country, you will find at each a microcosm of the hamlet, which is exclusively habited by Dalits and segregated, so that they are have a kind of a slavery relationship with the dominant caste. Now, similarly, in the globe, across the globe, we have been dismembered. And our intention is to ensure that these communities who have been dismembered, right from the Burakumin in Japan to across, the whole Dalits, the plantation communities, and several others, to Al Muhashin in Yemen, and then into Africa, the whole Haratim and Shambara and several other communities in Africa, to the Roma communities in Europe, ranging from Russia across Turkey to all Central Europe to Ireland across. And then you have Quilombola and other communities in the Latin American region. And of course, those who have been subjected to transatlantic slavery, who have populated Northern Americans. Now, to a certain extent, race as a category has been established, and established both domestically as well as internationally. And I think the tremendous amount of work done by Dr. Du Bois has made this not only a domestic issue, but at the UN, when he brought in conventions and pushed for not just the Universal Declaration, but also International Covenant for racial, the ICDR, the Covenant for the elimination of racial discrimination. Now, we need a similar body to ensure that there is elimination of any form of discrimination based on work and descent. And I think this trap handle is something as a tactic we need to ensure in order to have a similar frame, which of course, I think still we will need a tremendous effort, because what happened to George Floyd, I think still our voices are being stifled by the foot of the dominant caste. And then we need to ensure that needs to be completely removed, if not, done completely dismantled, and ensure that those implementation really reaches the communities. But nevertheless, if we do not have a framework, it is very difficult to move ahead. For the past 20 years, and I and many others, I think, you've seen, you heard just Meena with the International Dalit Solidarity Network, we have moved to see that as a Dalit, we can internationalize it. I think we have greatly succeeded. We not only internationalized it, but we built a solidarity. But we cannot move further. The only way to crack this is to ensure that we build this definition of discrimination based on work and descent. I do not like this word, but unfortunately, this is the only word that we have. And I think we have that very clearly that has been given to us by the UN on the principles and guidelines for effective elimination of discrimination based on work and descent. Let me just read it. Discrimination based on work and descent is any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on the inherited status such as caste, including present or ancestral occupation, family, community, or social origin. It goes on, dialect, accent, which has a nullifying effect or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing. And this, I think, is something that we are beginning to do. So there is a strap handle. We are trying to bring us together, and we need to have a declaration, similar to the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People. We need to bring that in and ensure both the international human rights organizations, movements like ours, see that the human rights defenders rise up along from the communities to bring this. Now, my last, Purvi, if I can have a minute more, I think you've just given me a signal that I have 2 more minutes or maybe 1 more minute, I don't know. That, I mean, all respect, we know we have great respect for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And, somewhere a man of that status, when he had come to India, how is it possible that he has missed Dr. Ambedkar? And he has locked on to Mr. Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And then he took back the memories and made Gandhi the hero of this whole system, which is struggling against, the kind of colonialism. And definitely that is an issue that we'll have to do, the political freedom. But how did he miss Ambedkar? How did he miss the Dalits? How did he miss the whole aspect? Of course, as Suraj has said very clearly, he went back and preached about it, and he was really offended when people have said that, you are an untouchable. But friends, I think at this age, after maybe, I do not know, maybe 80 years or 60 years after that, we just cannot afford to make such a mistake. Great things that we have seen. We need to make sure that we, in all these communities, whether it is African American, whether it is Asian, whether it is, all these communities. And we were recently engaging with the Palestinian movement. And there also, we are raising this issue. Are we relating with the Palestinian dominant when there are communities who have been enslaved? We have been enslaved. And today we are trying to bring us together. I think this strap handle is very important for us. And we need to ensure that we fight for not only visibilization, but ensure there is a solidarity among the race, among the indigeneity, especially the gender and the sexually marginalized communities of LGBTQ. But however, how can we ensure that we have a declaration and make sure that the glass ceiling which is there, it is cracked, and ensure that these are recognized sufficiently to take this forward. And I'm sure ICDR, International Dalit Solidarity Network, Global Forum, IMADAR, and several other movements who are here will be able to take the Roma, the Kilambola, the Haratim, the Dalit, and several other communities, whether they are from Africa, Asia, Europe, together with one voice. Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much for that presentation. And I want to first thank all of our amazing panelists for their very thought-provoking and informative presentations. We have about a half hour, I believe, of, we have